Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Holmes, and today what we're going to be discussing is how sugar affects the brain, especially with those who have ADD and ADHD. We're going to be talking about how dopamine and sugar are related. Now, back in the 1990s, there was a research article that expressed how sugar has no cognitive behavioral change on the brain. Now, as a clinician and through personal experience, I cannot disagree with that more. And I think a lot of other clinicians as well as teachers would definitely disagree with that research article. Luckily, there's new research that's actually showing the true impact sugar has on the brain. And that's what we're going to be discussing today. Now, as a disclaimer, ADD and ADHD does not mean you have a dopamine deficiency. That's why not all medications work equally for each individual person. So for more information on that, I highly recommend you look at the research article that we wrote at ibrainandbody.com. There's an article about dopamine and ADD and ADHD and how dopamine's not always the issue. For today, though, we're going to be talking about dopamine specifically and sugar. So, acute sugar intake. Cannot emphasize enough that word, acute sugar intake. Actually has shown to enhance a person's level of dopamine in their brain. Now, what they research is that when rats were injected with sucrose or sugar, they saw an increase in the extracellular amounts of dopamine in an area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. Now, there we find our reward-motivated behavior and our motor control. So our ability to move our large muscle groups as well as that reward behavior. So you finish something and you get that dopamine kick. You feel that sense of feeling of accomplishment. Dopamine helps work those pathways or helps enhance those pathways. An acute amount of sugar cause an increase in dopamine, which cause these areas of the brain to work a little bit better. However, how many of us are acutely eating sugar? Now, I'm not just talking about regular table sugar like stuff we find in cookies and brownies and donuts. I'm also talking about regular carbohydrates. So cereals, we're talking about breads, we're talking about pasta, pizza, muffins, donuts, bagels, and all of those lovely carbohydrate meals that we love. A lot of times when I'm working with individuals, we talk about diet. And when I work with, it seems to be women in particular, we talk about breakfast is oatmeal, snack, and sometimes lunch is a yogurt. And it's not until dinner when we're eating a quality meal of something like chicken and broccoli. Well, you loaded yourself up with a ton of carbohydrates your entire day. With kids, if they're eating a ton of cereal for breakfast, that is full of carbohydrates. An acute situation is not one time every day. It's that one time every day is actually a chronic intake of sugar, a chronic intake of carbohydrates that will eventually turn into sugar. So what happens when we chronically intake a lot of sugar and a lot of carbohydrates? It causes a downregulation of dopamine receptors. You need dopamine to bind to those receptors in order for us to feel the symptoms of dopamine, in order to get that reward behavior, in order to make those good choices and enhance different parts of the brain that stimulate behavioral control and good behavior. So that chronic sugar intake, what we see is our body has a defense mechanism against too much dopamine because we need that Goldilocks level of every neurotransmitter. So when we exceed that amount of dopamine by taking in too much sugar, we have a downregulation of dopamine receptors. So less dopamine in the cells. There are certain parts of the brain that need a healthy amount of dopamine in order to work appropriately. So for example, the dorsolateral and medial prefrontal cortexes help control behavior and motivation. These are very dopamine heavy. So when you have that chronic sugar intake, these areas of the brain are not working very well. And these are the classic signs and symptoms of ADD and ADHD, they aren't able to control their behaviors very well, and they're just not motivated. We set up all these reward systems for them, and the kids, and sometimes even adults, they have a hard time reaching those goals in order to feel the effects of the reward. Adults with ADD and ADHD have actually shown to have fewer dopamine receptors in these parts of the brain. The left ventral striatum, which is responsible, that is our reward behavior. It's responsible for our reward behavior. The left midbrain and left hypothalamus, which is responsible for memory, and a reduction in receptors correlates with the degree of inattention. That is what ADD and ADHD is. We're seeing less dopamine receptors in these parts of the brain, and that can be linked to chronic sugar intake. There's some research that's trying to ask, well, is it because of chronic sugar intake, or is it due to something else? And these kids and these adults crave so much sugar in order to get that appropriate dopamine release. So what happens when you have less receptors, that means you feel that dopamine less and less. So what our bodies will do is it will crave all of those carbohydrates, your pastas, your pizzas, your donuts, your muffins. You have those huge, intense craving for those in order to get your brain to release more and more dopamine. But that's a vicious cycle, because the more dopamine we get from that chronic sugar intake, the less receptors we have for it, which means our body will then start craving it even more. That's where we see a lot of food addictions. I work with a lot of kids who parents say, my kids won't eat anything other than a pasta or pizza or chicken nuggets or something along those lines, all those really carbohydrate heavy meals, and of course cookies and cakes and donuts and things of that sort. All of those, it could potentially be because they have fewer dopamine receptors and their body's craving that sugar in order for them to make more dopamine. But again, there's that vicious cycle. So we gotta start looking at where this dopamine issue is, if it truly is a dopamine issue, in what natural ways, other than giving them more sugar to kind of enhance the problem, what other natural ways can we increase dopamine? So one of the best ways to increase dopamine is through movement. Movement really works the brain. Now, I'm not talking about like this kind of movement with video games. I'm talking about big movements. Even being able to go for a walk 10 minutes a day will boost your mood and boost your dopamine. Then there are other things you can do. Get proper lab work done. Now, you need certain nutrients in order to make dopamine. So for example, you need magnesium, you need iron, you need appropriate B vitamins. Get that stuff checked to see if you need those things in order to even make dopamine. And of course, a well-balanced diet will also help with brain function and the production of dopamine. There are a lot of other suggestions that we have for proper dopamine levels. One of them is actually setting goals, really, really simple and easy goals to reach. Once you can get those simple goals, and it kind of becomes habit for these kids, you always got to start small. Start off with a small goal. When they reach their goals, and the more we use those pathways in the brain, the more that they'll start actually feeling the effects of that dopamine. Then start setting higher and higher goals, and they'll really start to get that motivation system, that reward system working for themselves. So if you've enjoyed this video, I highly recommend you check out our other ADD and ADHD videos, and I hope you enjoyed.